Let's see what's wrong with this thing. There's going to be something wrong every week, I feel like. That's just how this term is going. Okay, yeah. Here we go. Yep, you're in there. What are you mad at me about? PC, bam. Hey, cool. Yeah, we know, we don't care. How was the reading this week? A little more chill. All right, cool. Attendance sheet test. So today we're going to talk about two different things. Your book does not address measuring crime and victimization in this chapter. No. But we're going to because it's the only place that it really fit for the term. I guess I have to turn this on screen sharing, huh? Okay. Share screen. Hey, that's the one. So, a couple things with this chapter. Let's fix these lights. These are awkward lights. That's like everyone got a book that needs to first book. No. Not yet. For a copy of the book chapter. So if you didn't email me and you still need the book chapter, please do so I can send it to you. How many people fell victim to the shady dude in Troutdale that wrote his manifesto and made it look like the textbook? I know there's like 2. I know there's at least like, yeah, 3. Yeah. You did get scammed. So I went to the, yeah, and did you like look inside of it? It's just like this guy that's just like writing stuff. The cover page is like the same cover page, and the first page is like, oh, this author. Yeah, and it's literally just some guy, and it's printed in Troutdale, and I tried looking him up and I couldn't find him. I didn't look on 4chan, that's maybe where I should have gone, but no. And I went to the Amazon page and it's not there anymore. So I tried to return it. You should still be able to get a refund even if the product isn't available anymore, like through Amazon. Yeah. Yeah. You should be. Yeah. Yeah. Really sketchy, super sketchy. So yeah. I also contacted Sage and they sent me back a nice, automated email that said, thanks for your concerns. I'm like, all right, cool. Apparently you guys don't actually care about copyright infringement. So in that case, if anyone needs the chapter, just let me know and I'll send it to you because I don't care. So, this chapter is interesting because it talks about lots and lots and lots of different theories around crime and criminology. We want to be really careful when we talk about causality, right? As opposed to something like risk factors. Does anybody know the difference? Anybody? Anybody want to take a wild guess? Nobody? No? Cool. So when we talk about causality, we're talking about something that goes from A to B to C, and there's a very, very clear pathway. If not for A, B would not happen. And we have to have some kind of mechanism. We have to be able to describe the etiology of how A became B. So for instance, when we talk about health causes, there are a lot of things that have correlation, but not necessarily causality. For instance, we talk about things like body size or weight, and we say, well, this is correlated with this health problem or that health problem. But unless we can actually define the etiology of how A causes B, we cannot actually use the word cause. So instead, we talk a lot about risk factors. So risk factors are things that are statistically more likely to result in a certain outcome. So things like living in poverty, right? Things that we see on our risk assessments that we'll be doing later in the term. I know we kind of talked about that really briefly the first week, what you would see on a risk factor or on a risk assessment to see, like, is this person more or less likely to commit a crime? Those are all risk factors, but they're not considered causal, right? So first case in your book, pretty gruesome. Everybody read that about our friend Clarissa and her baby snatching, for lack of a better phrase. Did anybody look up the outcome of that case? No. So it is still in trial, well, going to trial as of April 2023. Both Clarissa and her daughter pled not guilty. Charges were first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, aggravated battery of a child, and dismembering a body. So they loaded up the charges on that one. There was a third person, Peter Bobak, who accepted a plea deal recently for 6 years total for obstruction of evidence for helping to hide the body. So when we talked about plea deals, that's how that goes. He's been incarcerated since it happened in 2019, so he'll get about 6 months in prison because he'll get time served for the time spent in jail during the trial. So however you feel about that. So what do people think? First of all, how would you define a crime? How do you decide what is a crime? You know, thinking about that pretty gruesome case and the things that they ended up actually getting charged with, how would we define overall what you think a crime is? Or think about, you know, when we read things about social contract theory and what a crime would be from that point of view.
Anything that goes against the laws that society has ordained to be correct behavior.
Yeah, actually. Yeah, absolutely. So anything that society decides, right? So it's subjective. Things that are a crime in one society might not be a crime in a different society. And something that's sanctioned by law, right? Has to be something that's actually written down somewhere, otherwise ordained by law. So it's supposed to be fairly objective. We know that that doesn't always happen, but that's the idea. So if that's what a crime is, what is the cause of crime? Or potential causes. If we're defining crime as something that any kind of behavior that society has deemed unacceptable, that should be dealt with publicly in some way.
The society sets like standards around people.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we define crime by whatever behavior is deemed acceptable by society, if society decides that something is or is not a crime, then it becomes a crime, right? It kind of becomes this self-defining definition. It's very circular. And there are things that we've talked about that we all kind of agree because of social contract theory that are sort of objectively not okay. Or because of consensus theory that are objectively not okay. Like as a society, we have decided that here are the times where it's okay to kill a person and here are the times where it's not okay to kill a person, right? We talked about examples last week when it is considered acceptable and times when it's not. So in order to prevent crime, we have to decide what actually causes it. So we're going to go through all these different theories in your book. Here's a couple of different definitions. What's your name? Ariana. So like Ariana said, this is going to be something that has to be defined by a statute or law, and it's something that society has decided. It can change over time. Things that were previously crimes are no longer crimes and vice versa. Note that it can be behaviors against the state or individuals or a community or against society, right? We talked last week about crimes against persons versus crimes against the public, all that kind of stuff. And as previously discussed, needs to include both the act and the intent. So difference between murder and manslaughter is intent. For the purpose of this course, because it's Intro to Criminal Justice and because we are in Oregon in the United States, we're going to use Oregon and United States definitions of crimes, right? So we'll be looking at Oregon statutes, federal statutes, that kind of stuff. When we talk about theory, because this entire chapter was all about different theories, a couple of things here to keep in mind. So a theory is basically just an explanation. So you see the apple fall from the tree. How do I explain that? I come up with the theory of gravity based on other things that I observe, right? It's not the same thing as a hypothesis. A hypothesis is, okay, well, something here is happening that causes the object to fall toward the center of the earth. But then I need to actually test it. I need to gather more evidence. And then once I have my evidence, I can form a theory. So if people tell you, oh, it's just a theory, tell them that they're full of crap. Because in order for something to be considered a theory, it has to have some sort of plausible explanation, and it has to be testable. It has to be observable. It has to be something that we can actually use the scientific method in. So a lot of the theories that we talk about in the book currently aren't considered valid, but at the time they were, based on the knowledge that people had, if that makes sense. And then as we gather new evidence and as we find new ways to gather evidence and find new ways of measuring things, or maybe we just have completely different philosophies or different paradigms through which we're looking at the evidence, the theory might actually change. But it doesn't mean the earlier one was totally incorrect. It means that it was only based on the evidence that was there at the time. So first school of thought here is classical and neoclassical. The idea here is very, very, very individualistic. So if you're going to commit a crime, it is purely because of free will. And you're making that decision based on weighing the cost versus the benefits. Does anyone remember the date range for this particular theory? Talk about it in your book. Anybody? Nope. What's that? Mm-hmm. Yep, so late 18th century, this is where we see the age of reason. Sort of all across Western society, philosophy is taking more of a positivist or an individualistic type of view where we're not basing things on spiritualism so much or on these sort of unseen phenomena, but again, on this idea of rationality. So it makes sense then that a theory like this would emerge during that time because that's the direction that the philosophy of society was going. Right, this is when different governments are forming, and this is, you know, following the American Revolution, the French Revolution, lots of upheaval in Europe, and people are starting to really think about things like, why do people act the way that they act? And previously, you know, it was thought that they do it because maybe they're inherently good, or they're inherently bad, or they're evil, or they're sinful, or they're influenced by demons, or whatever. So this at the time was pretty revolutionary because the idea is like, no, people have free will. They're able to reason, right? Even poor people, even people who at the time might not be literate, even your typical farm peasant still has the ability to have free will and to weigh cost and benefit. So this was kind of a big deal at the time because prior to that, you know, we didn't think about people like that. We didn't think of your average sort of like illiterate peasant living under some lord or landowners having those abilities. So this is the first time that we really start to look at that. So here, the goal of punishment, because under this belief, the idea is that people can decide for themselves whether or not committing the crime is worth the punishment. The goal of punishment is going to be proportional to the crime, and it's going to be there to defer criminal behavior. So if stealing an apple gets me a couple nights in the stocks, but I'm starving, that might be worth it. If stealing an apple gets my hand cut off, probably not worth it. But that's also not proportional. So you have all these people kind of having these debates about what would be considered a proportional punishment for specific crimes. And is it still going to be high enough to actually deter that behavior? One big difference between the classical school and a lot of current thinking is that punishment here is based purely on the crime, not necessarily on the offender. So under this philosophy, maybe you've stolen 30 apples before, maybe it's your first time, but you're going to get the same punishment because it's being based purely off of whatever the behavior is, not that person's history. In practice, we know that that wasn't often the case, right? Especially in smaller areas that are maybe run by magistrates or traveling judges, that kind of thing. But the idea here is that there should be some sort of punishment that's coded into the law. It's not going to be totally subjective the way that it was before. Neoclassical school. So we're going to shoot forward about 100 years here, and we see this idea kind of reemerge, this idea that crime is an individualistic choice, that people know right and wrong, that they're going to do whatever they feel like is right and wrong based on weighing the benefits and the costs. This theory arose to prominence again because we saw this huge surge in crime in the 60s and 70s, and people were really trying to find an explanation. And it was at a period in time where society, especially in the United States, was moving toward a much more individualistic model. So we're not looking at other influences, right? We're not looking at societal factors. We're not looking at things like poverty. We're not looking at things like unconscious behaviors, any of that stuff. This is purely individualistic and 100% free will based. What do you guys think of that? I thought the evidence. So who here has committed a crime ever? No one's ever, okay. I have 3 people who've like sped on the road, right? Everyone here has committed a crime, I feel like. If you haven't, you're lying. When you did, were you thinking, well, what are the pros and cons? Were you consciously thinking about those things? Probably not, right? Let's go back to our apple stealing friends. If you're really, really, really hungry and you're starving, are you able to think rationally?
No.
Probably not. So there's some evidence that this works for small level crimes, things like speeding. If we see an officer on the side of the road, we're going to slow down because we know that there's a higher chance that we'll get caught and the cost outweighs the benefit of getting to wherever you want to get faster. But if we don't see an officer on the side of the road, or your little app doesn't tell you there's an officer on the side of the road, you're probably going to go your normal speed because you don't see the consequence the same way that you might if it's right in front of you, right? There hasn't been some anecdotal evidence. There are people who will talk to you and say, you know, I changed my behavior because I didn't want to go back to prison, or I changed my behavior because I was afraid of getting the death penalty or this or that. However, there's not a lot of evidence, actual research evidence to back that up. What we have seen is a 2021 study that found that murder rates do not change based on the state's death penalty status before and after. This study is interesting. It's one of the first of its kind. Previously, we looked at studies that saw a high correlation between murder and murder rates and the death penalty. And then you could argue, well, the state needs a higher death penalty because people there murder more often, or vice versa. But this is the first study that actually looked before and after states that enacted or got rid of the death penalty and found no change. So we were able to actually measure some sort of causality there. There's another book called Deterrence and the Death Penalty. In this case, the authors argue that there's really not good evidence either way, because we have to look at all types of punishment, not just capital punishment. So you can make of that what you will. It would be interesting to see, they cite lots and lots and lots of different research in that book, and they basically find that there's an equal amount of research, and they're not looking specifically at the death penalty, they're looking to see whether or not the death penalty and other types of punishment will actually deter certain types of behavior, and they find that there isn't a great answer because there's research that suggests that it does, and there's research that suggests that it doesn't. And a lot of it is very much circumstantial, right? Positivist theory. So positivism is kind of this overall philosophy, essentially a scientific method. So things that are testable, things that are observable. Anytime you hear positivism, you should think scientific method. So most of your education thus far has been based in positivist theory. Your book gets this a little iffy. At one point, The authors say that positivism is kind of the opposite, that they don't believe there's free will. That is not the case. Positivism is the idea that there is plenty of free will and that we should stick to things that we can measure and observe, including free will, but not limited to. So we need to separate out. It doesn't say that, you know, things that we don't observe aren't real. It says that we need to kind of tease those out from the things that we can observe and measure and treat them a little bit separately or differently. So sociology and psychology, a couple definitions here. The big difference is one is individual based, the other is based on whole societies. It gets really fun if you want to talk about social psychology. That's kind of combining the two. We look at the individual behavior within the context of various social structures. For my psych majors, do you take a social psychology class here? Okay. So this theory sounds great in theory, not to be redundant, but it does lend itself to some problems, right? Because if we're only going on things that are testable and observable, that means we're only going with things the way they are right now. And so sometimes that is used to justify different types of biases, right? So let's say I go into one really, really bad neighborhood and that neighborhood has lots of crime and it also happens to have lots of one certain ethnic group or a different group, or lots of people that work one certain type of job or a different job or whatever it is that you're measuring. And I form a correlation there, right? Like I statistically, mathematically calculate a correlation. That is technically the scientific method. And I'm using things that are testable and observable. But if I try to establish any causality there and sort of misuse this theory, that can then be used to justify different legislation that maybe isn't going to be very effective in deterring crime. We've learned this the hard way on several occasions. Biological traits and developmental theories. This stuff gets really fun. So these theories have come in and out over time in terms of popularity. We saw these types of theories used a lot to justify things like slavery, to justify things like class-based oppression. And again, it's kind of based on, you know, how we're explaining deviant behavior is going to be based on what certain societies deem to be acceptable, but also people who have power within those societies. So they talk about this guy, Cesar Lombroso, in your book. This is an anthropologist. Started essentially the idea that we could look at things like body size, body shape, head size, head shape. People have probably seen like the phrenology heads that have the different spots that are supposed to correlate with different things. And basically looking at, okay, what is it about people who happen to commit crimes? What looks different about them? What is biologically different about them? And you'll notice that the traits that were observed were namely non-European traits. And this is at a time where people are starting to think about eugenics and starting to think about this idea that some human beings might not be full human beings. Some human beings might be a less evolved form of human beings, right? So this is being used to justify a lot of different things in society. But the idea that certain people are committing crimes based on what's considered to be deviant behavior is used to justify, you know, those other issues. We're gonna look at some examples. So this is a book that I have on ethnology. It is an early type of sociology. Lots of outdated language here. But you'll see sort of how the authors are using these essentially pseudoscientific observations to make huge leaps about behavior. So specifically, let's look over. So 390, they give you some descriptions of skull sizes, brain sizes, that kind of stuff. And then on 391, with our lovely, extremely racist illustration, the paragraph above that essentially talks about how, as a result of differences in things like skull sizes people behave differently. We know now that this is not true, but we still see remnants of this theory. We still see a lot of remnants of these types of theories even now when we talk about, for instance, gender in the legal system. When we talk about the activity of people's different like hormone development in the legal system. So lots of traces of this, even if it's not as outright. Here's another one. This one is interesting because they also look at climate. The authors here are happening about what happens when you take European people and put them into climates that Europeans did not evolve in, and that changes their behavior. These theories are really, really rooted in some pretty intense classism, because we know that a lot of lower income European folks ended up in the South and ended up, as they like to call it, the, let's see, where's it at here? Improvident and careless Southerners. So again, they're looking at this idea that biology and environment interact in some way to result in behavior. What's interesting in this particular chapter is that they actually acknowledge that people who are not of European descent did not have high crime when left alone and without European interference. So there's some really kind of interesting justification happening with misuse of these theories. This evolves into the idea that body types lead to patterns of criminal behavior. So when you walk into a prison, you're going to see a lot of really big dudes. Why do you think that is? Yeah, that's a big reason. The other reason is that if I'm a really, really big person and I assault you, I'm probably going to cause more damage than if a really, really small person assaults you, and I'm going to get charged with a higher crime, right? So we're going back to how we're defining crime. Really, really, really high correlation between body size and level of violence, but a lot of that's due to confirmation bias because they're looking at people who've been convicted or people who are already in trouble at the time, or sampling methods. They're also looking at people of specific types of European descent in the 19th and 20th century who just happen to have larger bodies. And what we find now is that there's very, very little actual statistical evidence. Once we introduce weapons into society and like have regular access to weapons, all of that correlation completely went away. You're going to find lots of little dudes in prison too, just faster and have better knives. This is a new one, because genetic testing is pretty new. We know that people who have XY chromosomes, folks that are typically, assuming that they have normal fetal development, designated male at birth, are statistically more likely to commit violent crimes than those with XX chromosomes. We also know that those that have an extra Y chromosome, so people that have an XYY, as opposed to somebody who has an XXY, which exists, about 1 in 1,000 births has an extra sex chromosome. So there's some interesting evidence here. We've done brain scan studies and we found that there are certain hormones that are etiologically linked to having a Y chromosome that can create a propensity to different types of behavior. However, when we actually try to look at the etiology of that, like what is it about having something like a little bit extra testosterone? What is it about that causes violent behavior? We actually don't find anything. And there's been studies where, say, we've injected people with a bunch of testosterone and find that they don't become more aggressive. So we've been able to kind of do actual before and after studies to see what happens. And a lot of these theories are sort of better explained by sociological factors, more behavioral type factors. So again, it's really, really important. Like we might have really, really good, really, really specific science. We might have things like brain scans, and we still want to make sure, because even with brain scans, those are mostly correlational because we don't know how the brain formed that way. We don't know what's actually making the brain form a certain way. We don't know how much of that is environmental. We don't know how much of that is hormonal. We don't know how much of that is genetic, because we're only doing a cross-sectional study of how that person is at the time after they've already committed some type of behavior. Be far more useful to look at people's brains throughout the lifespan, and see the differences in brains between people who commit certain types of behaviors and those who don't, and try to mathematically remove all those other environmental factors, but that would probably be logistically impossible and very, very expensive. So where we arrive is that it is probably both, right? We know that there are inherent factors and sociological factors. You'll see lots and lots and lots of adoption studies for those of you who are taking psychology classes. Adoption studies are extremely, extremely useful when they're well done. However, they also have some kind of inherent issues, right? So the idea with an adoption study is you have people who are identical twins, so they have 100%, almost 100% of the same genetics, and then you put them in two different environments and see what happens. And we will find things like huge, huge differences based on the kind of family that the person ends up in. Where this becomes tricky is that even with adoption studies, there are still lots of similarities in environment, right? Because if you take twin infants and separate them from their parents and adopt them out, there's going to be some serious attachment issues, some early trauma issues, going through the adoption foster care system, all those kinds of other environmental things. So even with what is essentially the purest type of study we can do, there's still going to be sociological factors that we might not be able to measure. So really what we want to do here is look at some of these biological factors as being both inherent and due to environment, because we know that those things can change based on environment. We know that environment can change your genes. We know that the way that your genes interact with both individual stressors, huge societal stressors. There's an entire field called epigenetics. It's all about studying how that happens. And it's really interesting stuff, but the basic takeaway here is that it is neither nature nor nurture, it is both. And that, you know, your genetics create essentially a range within which your environment will act, but that the environment still has huge impact there. You'll see this, for instance, like with schizophrenia. We know the heritability rate is about 50% in twin studies, which is really, really high. It's one of the highest for any known disorder, and yet it's still only 50%. Shifting gears here a little bit. So social structure theories. So we're still trying to use some sort of positivist paradigm here, what things that are measurable and observable, but taking kind of the opposite approach and saying, okay, it's not the individual, it's the context that they exist in. So things like class, poverty, race, family structure, immigration issues, all sorts of different types of what we consider to be like sociological oppression that result in higher crime rates among groups. One of the biggest difficulties with social structure theories is that we will often commit an ecological fallacy where we say, okay, well, we know in a group of 1 million people that happen to have these traits, crime is higher. So once again, we're going to assume some sort of causality there and say, okay, poverty results in crime. The ecological fallacy comes up when we try to attribute that to individual behavior. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. So we want to be really careful, again, how we talk about these things, the language that we use, and thinking about, you know, the individual acting within the environment. One thing to keep in mind that your book addresses or says some things essentially that the authors strongly dislike sociology as a field because of its sort of subjectivity. But you'll find that as you kind of go on in your education, that newer sociological research is very, very, very aware of the lack of objectivity, right? And looks at things like the place of the researcher within society and sort of their role within society and how that might influence what they're actually measuring. Lots of things to think about here. So 30s and 40s in Chicago. What's happening in the 30s and 40s in Chicago or in big cities in the United States in general? What's that? Mafia's been around for a minute, definitely. What else is happening? What's not happening in the 30s and 40s, at least the beginning of the 40s? What are two big things that we're like in between right now? Yeah, right. So World War just happened. World War II is about to happen. Everything's kind of a shit show. We've got lots of immigration between the South and the North. This is when we first start to see kind of our second wave of mass migration as people move up to more industrialized areas. So huge, huge, huge upheaval in society. So according to this theory, it is the lack of organization, it is something about the upheaval itself and this sort of being in transition that results in large scale crime. There's also a lack of social structures to kind of keep up with all these big moves. So lots of families are separated because people are moving all over the place looking for work. We've just come out of a depression. Schools are not great right now. There aren't enough churches, all these sorts of social structures that are there, at least in theory, to kind of keep people organized in some way. They take it a step further and look at individuals. So they talk specifically about, unsupervised youth, right? So we've got these orphan trains for the last 50 years or so that are shipping kids out to the West, to stick them on farms or down into coal mines, so on and so forth. This is where that starts to stop. And so we have lots of kids around whose parents maybe died in the war. Right? Daddy died in World War I, mommy has to go work in a factory. So now I'm running the street like an urchin and I'm going to form antisocial relationships with other street urchins and do bad things. Keep in mind, this is what people were observing, right? This is what people are going out looking for. So that's kind of the perception. Not a lot of good scientific evidence in either direction. We do have lots of evidence that things like poverty, things like migration, and all these other, issues that are arising at the time do have really high correlation with crime, but we don't have evidence that it's the disorganization itself that's correlated with crime. Mostly because it's really hard to measure something like societal disorganization. Strain theory. This one is interesting because it looks both at people choosing to ignore norms or people who feel they cannot participate. So we're looking at the norms of society in a big picture way and how individuals act within that context. So the strain exists, normlessness between sort of this idea of whether or not a person has access to what society has to offer, and that they turn to crime when they feel they don't have other legitimate options. Lots and lots of evidence for this, particularly when it comes to property crime. There's been a ton of research showing that if people have more stable housing, they are less likely to engage in things like petty theft, vandalism, other types of property crime. However, there's not good evidence when it comes to violent crimes, particularly crimes of passion, issues around substance use, issues around mental illness. We tend to think of those as being correlated with crime. And we know that when people that are mentally ill or dealing with those sorts of substance use disorders and so on and so forth have things like stable housing, access to treatment, so on and so forth, they are not more likely to commit crime. We also know that people who have, people who come from wealthier families or live in certain neighborhoods or certain parts of society, certain strata of society who deal with mental illness, substance use disorder are less likely to engage in crime than people who have those same types of issues, but who live in poorer neighborhoods, don't have income, don't have stable housing, so on and so forth. This is another book. I collect old creepy books. They're not all creepy, but they're did a certificate in history and philosophy of science, and part of that was having to do primary sources, meaning reading lots of stuff that's really, really old. So this particular book is about prostitution in the Victorian era. So here they are talking about the difference between the medieval town and the modern city and how it changes the nature of prostitution. The author here refers to modern cities as latter-day Babylons, which I think is just really fabulous. So they're not denying that sex work existed in medieval towns. They're talking about this shift, at least according to the author, that they're seeing in the nature of sex work. They're seeing what they consider to be more deprived behavior around sex work, higher STIs, all sorts of stuff like that. And they're saying that this is due to kind of this breakdown in community, having populations that float between cities, all that kind of stuff. They're still using lots of really, really strong individualist type language, right? Temptation and inducement, stuff you might hear like a priest tell you. However, the author is still looking at the idea that this is happening because of the environment. The conditions favor not only irresponsibility, but concealment. The mere numerical increase, so there's too many people, right? And the absolute impossibility of classifying women and men as virtuous or vicious on account of sheer ignorance of their life. And it goes on to say characteristics and so on and so forth. So basically the author is saying there's too many people in one space. The conditions are bad. Industrialization is a thing. Everything's dirty. People are living in tenement houses. The family structure, traditional family structure has fallen apart. Therefore, this particular crime has increased. So this was written in like the 1800s, but you probably still hear a lot of this rhetoric, right? When we talk about like crime control model, things going on in the 1980s and 1990s, the drug wars, you still hear a lot of very, very similar language used around this idea of, well, it's because people are in cities. Well, it's because people don't have proper family structures, all those sorts of exact same ideas. So even though when we read it here, it looks a little ridiculous, we do still hear remnants of these theories, even in modern day. Process theories. What time is it? So here it's looking more at upbringing and social environments. So, okay, it's not just big society stuff. We're going to look more at meso and micro levels. What's happening in the family? What's happening in the immediate surroundings for that individual? This is useful because we know that not everybody who lives in an impoverished neighborhood ends up committing property crime, right? There are lots of people who don't. So we have to come up with some sort of theory to explain that. How many people here speed in the car because when you were taught how to drive, your parents also sped in the car? Right? So that's social process theory. This is normalized within, a small social circle, therefore it's the normal thing. Learning theory. So we're picking up our behavior from others. You've got our boy Edwin Sutherland. They talk about him in your book. also in Chicago, and he's mostly looking at organized crime, which is fascinating because organized crime looks really, really different than, these other sort of crimes of poverty that earlier theorists were talking about. So here, we're really saying that people pick up behavior from others, specifically their peers, and that is going to be more important than these other, bigger sociological issues. And the reason he came up with this is because he found that things like organized crime happen in all across the board. Low-income neighborhoods, high-income neighborhoods, wealthy neighborhoods, middle-class neighborhoods, same rate among different racial groups, all of that. And so he determines like, okay, it's not those big sociological issues, maybe it's these smaller sort of individual socialization processes that are happening. So if you come from a family where it's normal to fight, the idea here is that you might be more likely to fight yourself, and vice versa. Control theory. This one's really fun. This is the idea that everyone is born bad and selfish and terrible, basically antisocial. So you are born without any desire or need to be a member of society, and that you must be socialized to follow the rules of society. So there are two different things to look at here. One is the big picture. So a person chooses to participate in society in exchange for whatever, kind of like in consensus theory. And then, just like we talked about, that individuals can also be taught certain behaviors in their families. So there's an idea that both things are happening. So when you look specifically at bond to society, there are 4 things that are taken into account here. So does the person have attachments to family and pro-social others as opposed to antisocial others? When we do risk assessments, these are actually things that we measure, that we ask about. Do you have any friends? Okay, what kind of friends do you have? Are any of your friends incarcerated? Do your friends use drugs? Do your friends not use drugs? All that kind of stuff. Commitment to social norms and institutions. So this is kind of a lot of person's beliefs and attitudes. Do you value things like education? Do you value things like staying out of prison? Is that important to you? Involvement in conventional leisure activities. So do you have hobbies other than stealing catalytic converters? What do you do for fun? Do you engage in community groups? Do you go to community center? Do you go to church? Are you a member of the Kiwanis? So on and so forth, what we consider to be pro-social associations. And then belief in shared norms, morals, etc. So this is like, do you think it's wrong what you did, right? And this is something we ask people. For instance, if you commit a sex crime, one of the big things that we look at for measuring your SO level 1 through 3, whether or not we consider you to be predatory, is whether or not you thought that what you did was wrong, whether or not you actually can acknowledge that it was a crime, or do you try to justify it in some way? So do you believe in those shared norms or morals? There's lots and lots and lots of evidence for how useful these are. Particularly when it comes to recidivism, meaning people who recommit crimes. The problem with that is that it, again, becomes very, very circular, right? If we're defining crime by whatever is, antisocial behavior, not following the rules of society, and we have people that we know have already done that, of course, if they rank higher on these types of assessments, then, it makes sense, right? So it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is useful, though, when we're looking at whether or not people are able to whether or not people have been reformed. And we have done studies looking at before and after people's risk assessments after they've gone through certain types of treatment. So we know, for instance, with sex offenders, before and after treatment, we see very, very different results for some people. Generally, lower level sex offenders. Labeling theory. So at the macro level, crime is a crime because we decided that it is, right? We're calling it a crime, therefore it's a crime. Kind of that circular definition again. At a more individual or on a group level, this is when people start to internalize those identities. For instance, I've got a boy that I'm working with right now who has basically said, well, everyone's going to think I'm a criminal anyway, so fuck it, I'm just going to do what I want. There's some really interesting evidence for this. So there's two studies that I down at the bottom that you should be able to get to on Canvas. And the first one, looking specifically at gender. So take little boys and little girls, give them the exact same task, see how they do. They tend to do almost exactly the same. But then that's our control group. If we take another group of little kids, separate them by gender and tell them that either they're good at it or they don't, it results in changes in performance. There's been tons of studies that are similar to this. This one just happened to be kind of the most concise that I could find. We've seen studies like this looking at things like math exams, SAT scores, so on and so forth, where if you tell people that, oh, girls do better on the SATs, and then you give them all the SATs, they end up doing better. So there is something about internalizing that information. In the second study, it's interesting because it kind of unlinks personal identity. So they did the same thing, but they had girls use boys' names instead and try to perceive themselves in more traditionally masculine ways, and they found a change in performance based on that, compared to the girls who use traditionally feminine names and were not told, pretend you're a boy. So even if, without that sort of socialization, we're finding very, very quickly we can get people to change their behavior just based on perceived identity. Social conflict theory. Let's go back to our friend Rousseau, right? We have groups of power, we have groups that don't have power, and they're always going to be at odds with each other no matter what. And that's how society works. Society works because the people that have power exploit the ones that don't, and society continues to work because the people that don't continue to provide labor and whatever else for the people that do, as long as you feed them enough and pay them enough to keep them happy, so on and so forth. So within this theory, any kind of criminal behavior, antisocial behavior is behavior that negates the status quo, especially when it comes to things like property crime. This last statement is particularly interesting because there's lots and lots of evidence for this, particularly when it comes to drug use. So as you read through the Alexander book, there are several studies that she cites in there that look at things like marijuana use and finds that affluent and wealthy people use just as often as poor people, but that's the latter much more likely to be apprehended and punished for it. Feminist theories. The feminist theories in your book are kind of outdated. They're really sort of based on like second wave feminism of like the 70s, and we're mostly past that now. They don't really take into account like third wave, like more intersectional feminism, but whatever. The idea here is that patriarchy, the way that we have society set up as a patriarchal society, puts pressure on men, and that is the reason for higher rates of crime, especially violent crime. So circling back to social learning theories, what types of behaviors are considered to be normal or socially acceptable for different genders? There is some interesting evidence for this. And your book has a whole section about crime among women, and there has been an increase in crime as women have left the house, right? Because you're no longer barefoot in the kitchen, you're outside, you're probably more likely to commit a crime. However, we have found that arrests overall have decreased, at least over the last 10 years. The other example that it gives is that juvenile girls who run away, running away is considered a crime, by the way, if you're underage, are often escaping abuse. But what it doesn't look at is whether or not the same is true for juvenile boys. So again, we want to be really, really careful here when looking at causality. In many ways, the arguments made by feminist theory are also circular, right? Because we know that in families where there is abuse, there are different types of abuse based on gender. And a lot of that is socialized. We also know that one of the reasons why we don't necessarily measure abuse history for juvenile boys, or at least we didn't used to, we do now, at least in Oregon, is because it didn't occur to people to measure victimization among boys, because it didn't occur to people that boys could be victimized, which also sort of fits into feminist theory around the idea of patriarchy and pressure put on different genders. Let's see, let's take a break. Let's take 5 minutes because the other stuff we're talking about kind of goes together better. Everybody still awake? You guys are quiet today. No one's like arguing with me. I mean, you should. Okay, it is a long day. I agree with you, definitely. But like, this is one of those topics though that people should argue about. But I mean, that's fine. Pause this. Stop share. Pause.
Excited with the sketchy book? Yeah. Where did you say it came from again? Like. Yeah, because that is from Oregon.
Yeah, it literally even says like printed in Troutdale. Yeah.
It's such a weird book.
It is really random. Yeah. And I didn't recognize the name, and I'm like, this person's probably, and it's a common text book used in criminal justice. So clearly this person, I mean, all of you could be making a lot of money, right? Like you could just publish some random crap. It probably cost him like $20 to print that and sell it for $60. And it's an interesting, I looked through it and I'm like, it's either this guy's like dissertation, in which case he's not gonna get his PhD because he's clearly plagiarizing, or it's his manifesto and he's gonna murder me in my sleep, and that's fine. But never heard of the guy, couldn't find him. Publisher didn't care because it was already removed off of Amazon when I went and tried to look, so made his money and decided to peace out. See if he pops up again for spring term.
Gonna go find another book to go.
It's just completely random. And the stuff that's in it, what's so funny is that the stuff that's in it is criminal justice related, but it's just like he took a bunch of his papers and just like put them in there, probably to get like keyword searches and things like that, so it would still show up. Like whoever this kid is, he's super smart, but also using it for to scam other students, which is really kind of terrible. Like don't scam college students, like you guys are poor. Like scam somebody else, scam somebody who like maybe deserves it a little bit, but like don't scam other, especially other college students. Like don't do that. That's messed up. Is everybody back? Looks like it. Cool. So situational crime. Lots of different theories combined here. And it actually acknowledges that lots of different factors can lead to different types of crimes, right? So the types of factors that lead to things like property crime might not be the same factors that lead to, say, drug use, which might not be the same factors that lead to violent crime. So there's a little more nuance here. We talk about situational crime. We're looking at routine activity theory primarily. So this is looking at the elements necessary for a crime to occur, as well as how we can prevent it. If you go into any kind of law enforcement, a lot of the evidence that you collect will be based on this particular theoretical orientation, because we're looking at things like what was the situation, who was around, was there opportunity, what was the motive, all those kinds of things. So the idea here is that crime will occur inevitably if the opportunity is there, if it's easy, if it has low risk and provides large rewards, if the person feels provoked to do it for some reason. and if they feel like it could be justified or excusable. So here we're actually interviewing lots and lots and lots of people and saying, what would result in you committing this crime? And people basically, you know, give the evidence for these things. So this comes up in the 60s and 70s following World War II. Again, huge societal shift, resulting in an increase in crime. There are 3 things here. So first, the offender must be motivated. There's a reason they're doing what they want to do. All right, every single one of us is going to leave here and walk out past the parking lot. Very few of us are probably going to consider stealing a car, because very few of us probably have the motivation to steal a car. You're probably going to think about it now because I said it, but you otherwise wouldn't think about it. If you weren't motivated, you would look for a suitable target. Depending on your motivation, you might go for, you know, the Lamborghini because you want to go for a joyride. Or if you just need to get from A to B, you're going to go for like the 90s Honda. That's easy to break into. And the last piece here is absence of capable guardian. When they say guardian here, they're looking at things like witnesses, people that would otherwise keep you from doing the thing. Parents, cops, so on and so forth. So here is where we see all of these kind of be taken into account. And these, again, are the things that we mostly look at in law enforcement. So first, we want to, you know, make it take a little bit more effort. People are less likely to steal things that are up on high shelves. People are less likely to steal things that are locked behind a door. Put up a camera, even if it's fake, so on and so forth. Make it riskier. Reduce the rewards. Probably less likely to steal somebody's bicycle if it has their name plastered all over it than some random bicycle, because it'll be more obvious, right? It's more likely I'm going to get caught, and it's not going to be as rewarding because it's not mine. It says Joe on it or whatever. Reduce provocations. So this is where we see a lot of those other theories come into play. So reducing frustrations and stress. That could be things like addressing housing instability, addressing food access, all those kinds of things. Avoiding disputes. Reducing arousal and temptation. Neutralizing peer pressure and discouraging imitation. Has anyone here ever read like news articles about mass shootings in other countries? If you do, one thing you will notice is that they very rarely will name the shooter. And they don't talk about the shooter's life. They don't talk about the shooter's background. If they have some kind of manifesto, it doesn't end up published. Whereas in the United States, we tend to really focus in on the person who actually committed the crime and less so the victims. And the idea is that we should be discouraging imitation, right? In the United States, we get lots of mass shooters, and we get lots of mass shooters who will then cite other mass shooters as their inspiration. And so there are other countries where we don't do that, right? Where we try to kind of keep that stuff under wraps with the intent of trying to discourage imitation. So they don't do, you know, they don't share information about the shooter. They don't share information about why necessarily they did what they did. They might say like, well, it was because of ethnocentrism, whatever. But they're not sort of giving that person the kind of media time or airtime that we do here. And we do see that that discourages imitation in a lot of ways. Removing excuses. So lots of people that are on probation and parole can't have drugs or alcohol, even if their crime had nothing to do with drugs or alcohol, because we know that those things can change behavior, can lower one's inhibition, so on and so forth. Remind people of things that are wrong. Make the rules really clear, all those kinds of things. Psychological theories. Your book doesn't really get into these in this chapter. We mentioned psychology earlier. The focus here is really on individual personality traits. Once again, lots of circular evidence, because if we are defining personality traits by behaviors, then of course we're going to find that people with certain personality traits are more prone to certain behaviors. A lot of you have probably seen Criminal Minds, pretty popular, about the forming of the behavioral health unit in the FBI. So initially the BHU was used to compile data about violent criminals, especially sex crimes. And that data was not at all useful for predicting new crimes. So spent lots and lots of time interviewing and creating all sorts of assessments about people that had already been convicted of sexually violent crimes, and found that the things we were measuring weren't at all useful. What the evidence suggests is that psychological profiling has about the same efficacy as all the other types of investigation and should be used kind of as an additive, but not as a replacement. However, what we have found in the last 10 to 15 years or so is that we can use profiling for other types of crimes, things like mass shootings and terrorism, and based on other factors, so things that are more situational, things like socialization, things like having pro-social peers, so on and so forth, not just personality traits. So kind of have to take all those things into account. Anybody, one of the paper topics is on psychological profiling. If anybody chooses that for their topic, you should get this guy. It's the volume. So these three fellows are the folks that did the original research for forming behavioral health units and psychological profiling in the FBI. And this book is all the assessments that they did and all of their results that they found. So it's pretty lengthy because it's a lot of data. That is interesting and a great sort of primary source for people who are interested in that particular topic.
If that was your topic, will you?
I mean, if there's 5 of you and you all want the book, then we're gonna have like Hunger Games.
Right.
But you can go to the library, probably. I don't know if it's at this library, but I'm sure it's at a library. Yeah. Just gonna walk into the George Fox Library and be like, yes, do you guys have sexual homicide? Just see what they say. I mean, that's fine. It's for my criminal justice class. Like, once you say that, then they'll be like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But this is really interesting because you'll see a lot of, because when they published this data originally, it was, several decades ago, until you'll see some of that language and some of that rhetoric show up in the actual research. So that is there. If anybody wants to look at it, take a picture of the ISBN so that if you do order it, you get the right one and not like some weirdo from Troutdale's. So let's look at antisocial personality disorder. This is the diagnostic criteria from the DSM-5, not the DSM-5 TR, because I don't have it yet, because it's expensive and I don't care. So when we look at diagnostic criteria, those of you who, I got several folks that wrote on their note cards that they're interested in going into counseling, you'll be doing lots of DSM-5 stuff, and you'll be doing lots of diagnostic criteria. So antisocial personality disorder, you can see here that there are lots of behaviors that are listed, which is interesting because personality by definition is supposed to mean fixed and unchangeable traits about who a person is. And yet with this particular diagnosis, we're looking at a lot of behaviors. So again, if we are defining crime as certain behaviors, and we're saying, oh, people with antisocial personality disorder have a higher, risk factor for committing crime. Well, duh, because a lot of the criteria here could be used to describe criminal type behavior. Like number 1, for instance, person commits a crime. And the new DSM, that has actually been taken out because somebody was like, hey, genius psychiatrists, maybe if we're going to use this to define people that are more likely to commit crimes, we should get rid of the criteria that says that they commit crimes, because otherwise it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and it becomes a completely useless measurement. So that is no longer there. Things that are interesting about this and other personality disorders, if you've ever been diagnosed with a personality disorder, you should probably tell whoever diagnosed you that they're full of crap, because it is not good practice to diagnose before 18. And it's not good practice to diagnose between 18 and 25 because your brain's not done and you probably, your personality is not technically fully developed yet. The other thing here with, at least with antisocial personality disorders, that the behavior must have been present previously, meaning that before, as a child, they were diagnosed with conduct disorders. So we're seeing a lot of the same behaviors throughout the lifespan, indicating that it's not just, teenage rebellion or, whatever. And last but not least, it is not happening because the person is manic. It's not happening because the person is having psychosis like in schizophrenia or any other kind of mental disorder. You don't have to memorize this, but you will see this get thrown around a lot if you work in correctional facilities, because there are a lot of people who are diagnosed based on the old criteria, particularly criteria on A1, who, when you get to know those people and really study those people and assess them, they don't actually meet the full criteria. Or they only meet it in certain situations. One of the key features of any personality disorder is that it has to happen in multiple domains. For example, we see a lot of people who get hospitalized and get diagnosed with something like borderline personality disorder, which is not a good diagnosis because people act completely different when they're hospitalized compared to when they're not. So good personality disorder diagnosis is going to include looking at the person's behavior in multiple domains across the lifespan with multiple people, not just in certain situations. That's my rant because this is what I do all day. We're gonna watch a video and it has an error, but I have the link this time. So screw you, Google Slides. Jerks. This guy's cool. Are you still screen sharing? All right, let's see. Are you gonna blast sound at me? You're on 92. Yes, you are. All right, let's see what happens. Hey.
My face was much more painful. My face. So, usually I decided to start the experiment. I would have to sheet of paper with simple math problems. Everybody can solve, but I would give you enough. If I had it over, I would say, ask you a sheet of paper, I'll tell you. The 500 over, I would say, is a piece of paper, and you tell me how many. We now solve 7 questions. Now, it wasn't as if you could go to the other one. Then what we started, now, economic eating is a very simple cost-benefit analysis. Say, what's the probability of being wrong? How much do they stand to gain from cheating, and how much punishment do they get if they're wrong?
What theory would that support? That's the first one we talked about. Yep, classical theory.
If you weigh these options out, you would say, no. No. It's like it's tested. But some people use every much like they how hard it is still. You play the 10 cents for correct question, 50 cents is not applied for $10 for correct question. You would expect that as the amount of money of the table increases, people will cheat more when you have more than they pay. A lot of people cheating the probability of being caught. Some people shredded half the sheet of paper with some evidence left. Some people shredded the whole sheet of paper. Some people shredded everything when opposite will maintain themselves on the ball of money that they was done. Expected as the probability of being caught was down, people would cheat more, but again, this was not the case. And a lot of people cheated unjust by a little bit. The unsensitive people did not consent. So if people are not sensitive to the economic rational theory, people who try to recall the Ten Commandments are sample recall the Ten Commandments. But those people who try to recall the Ten Commandments, even though it wasn't that they're more religious It gives self-declared entities. And this is something we want to bring into the education system, so we can try to get people to sign for it. I understand it. This was about decreasing the time frame, but increasing the time frame. The same refrigerator. No bill was regulated. This is not a good. They can't do after that. It's experimental. I solved X problems, give X dollars. They think trying to people. I solved X problems. Not even with dollars, we pay with something. They could be something else, but well, people decide it's a dollar. But the following vision, how bad would you feel about taking a sense of what we talk about, or taking a sense of taking because everything has for Tuesday, we pay like nothing with the different. But this did not solve the big problem I had with everyone yet. But everyone is also a social element. People see each other behaving, in fact, everything we go to. That was what does this cause? You don't know this one. But because doesn't end up with all the money to this person. And at the end, that's it. Yes, that actually happened with the students do that. The 32nd, it said, I solved everything. What do we do now? That's the finish. Now we can happens. Other people think more or achieve less. That's what happens. Everyone has a question. Here's the thing, we read this in ecology about this. I think that this group that this recipe. All of this subject to me in the experiment, ecology realized. Now, the ecology student, that's the economy. Feeling went out. But he actually had the university of this is important because remember what the law is about. I think everybody that is cheating. The experiment is that it's going on. What is so much about this project is the topic here? It's about rules for people. Somebody from an in-group team that is more appropriate. But somebody from another terrible people, not terrible, but somebody you don't who associate themselves with, nothing is going to get done. All the time people are never supposed to event. And those people can cheat just by remind people of the reality that she that to get the distance of the object of money, for example, people should talk and lose
couple different theories are being supported here, right? So somebody mentioned classical theory at the beginning. What else did you hear happening? What about the idea of in-group versus out-group? What does that fit into? What's that? More specific? Really close. So it starts with social. You're allowed to look, right? Just like on your exam, look at your notes. What's that? Yeah, it could be both process or social learning theory. Right, because again, we're talking about students, so we don't know, is this, having gone to Pitt and spent time at Carnegie Mellon, I can tell you it's a very, very real thing. There's like this weird, like, Carnegie Mellon students tend to have this bit of a superiority complex. And like I would say classes, they're like, oh, you're from Pitt. And it was just a weird thing. So there's definitely this sort of in-group, out-group thing. And you could see this with any groups that feel like they already have some kind of competitiveness. But when we're also talking about both of those theories, we're looking at, okay, what is the norm for my in-group? And also what is the norm for how I was raised and what I was taught? So two kind of different things going on there. In this particular case, we're looking at in-group, out-group. So both theories could really apply because there are sort of differences between, the people that ended up at one school versus the other. One is a huge public university, which is also a top 10 medical school, but the other one is a kind of a classic Ivy League. So there's always this like argument over like, oh, who's better? And like, you both suck, but whatever. We were going to take a break later, but we already did. That's a criminal. That's what criminals look like. If anyone cares. See the puzzle? Yeah, ruining my puzzle. That is not supposed to be on the table. Knows he's not supposed to be on the table, but the benefit of getting to lay on the cardboard with the puzzle outweighs the risk of I'm going to get yelled at. We're going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about how we measure crime, because obviously if we're going to support one theory or another, we need to know how to actually measure what we're talking about. So we talked about this before, being critical of statistics and also knowing how to use them properly, because you have to use them. I added this in because a lot of you said that you hadn't taken any statistics classes yet. And so I realized like, oh, when I talk about these things, some of these poor students might have no idea what I'm talking about. So descriptive statistics versus inferential statistics. Anybody know the difference? So descriptive statistics are things like pure demographics, right? So I have a class with this many students, this many of them are freshmen, this many of them are sophomores, this many of them are juniors, this many of them are seniors, this many of them are psychology majors, this many of them are criminal justice minors, so on and so forth. They're necessary. You have to have that data, right? You have to know what you are measuring, what that group looks like, but it is not sufficient for complex issues. Anybody remember what I said about typos a few weeks ago? What's your name? Brendan? All right, Brendan, you get the bonus point. You're gonna have to email me because I don't have a pen. Does anybody not know about the typos thing? So if you catch a typo and you tell me, you get a bonus point. Inferential statistics. So this is things where we're actually looking at individual variables. So we might, this is where you're gonna see things when you're reading studies, where we're taking things like the descriptive statistics and we're comparing them to each other and trying to tease out different variables mathematically. So here's where we're really trying to establish causality, or at least get as close to it as possible. Everyone knows Mean Girls, right? Everyone see Mean Girls? The limit doesn't exist. That's kind of how causality is. We can get really, really, really close to it. We very rarely can actually reach causality, but we can get close to it. We can use things like chi-square models or linear regression models and all those other things that you're going to see showing up in the studies that you read. So just something to keep in mind. Typically, when you read a study, it's going to start with the descriptive statistics. Here's all the demographic information about the people in our study. Here's why we chose this particular group. Here's how we're choosing our control group based on what, so on and so forth. And then the inferential statistics are typically going to be what we're actually trying to measure. We're going to have the, our independent variables and our dependent variables and see, okay, we added some sort of independent variable here, right? Some sort of like ABA style thing where I treat this group with one thing and leave the control group with something else, or don't do anything with them. And then that's how I'm going to see the results and use inferential statistics to actually measure those results. Keep in mind that these numbers are rates, right? Typically, it's going to be rate per 100,000. So it's not 5 out of 10, it's 5 out of 100,000. You are going to see out of 100,000 rates in almost every field. You're going to see that in public health. You're going to see that when we talk about things like COVID morbidity rates, mortality rates. Those are almost always measured per 100,000. Somebody at some point decided that that was a good convention. Notice how the rate fluctuates. So there might be a higher number descriptive, statistic-wise, of murder and manslaughter, for instance, in 2015, than say 2009, and yet the rate is actually lower. And that's why you want to pay attention to those things. Like, what are we actually measuring? What is the control group? How big is the population? So on and so forth. Some databases that you might find useful for when you are working on your projects, which we're going to assign, I think, next week. I think that's what I put on the syllabus, but if I'm wrong, then that's fine. FBI Uniform Crime Report, UCR. Created initially in 1929. Prohibition era, rise of organized crime, and also a need to have some sort of centralized database. Because otherwise we have different counties, different municipalities, different states measuring things completely differently. Again, everything here is measured per 100,000. They separate things into part 1 and part 2 offenses. Notice how these aren't necessarily person to person versus property, so they are categorized a little bit differently than we're used to talking about. National Incident-Based Reporting System. So this is what you use for a lot of jobs in Oregon. If you work at the state hospital, if you work for the prison system, this is what an officer pulls when they pull you over and they get your ID and look up your data. So this isn't going to include things like arrests and other contacts with law enforcement, as well as convictions. It also pulls up things that could be in civil court, like restraining orders, if you have an existing warrant, all that sort of stuff. So a lot of states have rap sheets, record of arrests and prosecutions, but this one's national. So when this is pulled, it shows things like, hey, you have a warrant in Idaho. What they choose to do with that information depends on the situation, but this is a thing that exists. This will also give things like aliases, last known address, all that kind of stuff. Other ways of measuring crime is asking people, which seems like common sense, but it wasn't done until fairly recently. Because we know that not everybody reports crimes, and there are lots of crimes that are done that never get charged or convicted or so on and so forth. So we also have the National Crime Victimization Survey, NCVS. Oops. Obviously, this is going to tend to have higher rates because it includes things that aren't reported to law enforcement. What makes this particular survey interesting is that it also collects data on the victims, not just the perpetrators. So in addition to demographics and other information about perpetrators, it's also collecting that data on victims so we can see who's being victimized, not just who's committing crimes. What are some reasons somebody might not report a crime?
If they're also like committing a crime.
Okay. Yeah, we see that a lot with drug use, for instance. People are less likely to call in things like overdoses if they're worried about getting arrested or getting in trouble. What else?
If they knew.
Yeah. Can you tell me more? Like if they don't want that person to get in trouble or that kind of thing? Yeah, absolutely. We see that a lot in domestic violence situations, family abuse situations. Oftentimes victims will feel some sort of obligation to the perpetrator. Yeah, Andrew Hendricks?
I was going to say like that, but also getting for the pressure not to.
Yeah, definitely. Snitches get stitches, right? And some of this is also social norms. Some people don't like having police presence in their neighborhood, or some people don't find it worth it, right? Or they don't want to be involved. We see that I don't want to be involved thing a lot. There's some interesting studies. Is anyone familiar with the Kitty Genevieve case? So this is kind of a classic case that you'll learn about in your psych classes where this woman basically gets stabbed to death like multiple times. Well, she gets stabbed to death multiple times. She gets stabbed and then the perpetrator like leaves for a while and she's like screaming and out on the street and then he comes back and stabs her some more. And like there's people have their windows open, people are seeing this happening, people are, they hear it happening, and then he comes back a third time and finally stabs her to death. And at first, when this happened, the conclusion that people made was, wow, people just really suck and didn't want to do anything because people are not naturally altruistic. Turns out what actually happened when they interviewed the witnesses was that every single person had assumed that someone else had already called. That's why when they say, if you're being victimized, you should point to specific people and say, you call 911, or like if you're sick or something, right? Or you're doing CPR, you point at a specific person and make them do it, because otherwise everyone just assumes someone else is doing it. So we also want to be careful about how we kind of, how we interpret data. Like the first social scientist that looked at that said, wow, these people are all terrible. They just let this happen. How could something like this happen? And it turns out that none of them are really bad people. They all just assumed someone else had already taken care of it. Like, here's this terrible thing that's happening. How could someone have not already called? Some specialized crime reporting. So some databases that you might want to look at if you are thinking about doing a topic in any of these areas. SPLC is really, really interesting. They've really beefed up their data over the last decade or so. Specialize in hate crimes, terrorism, mainly domestic. UNICEF, they do all sorts of stuff, but not very many people know that they also do crime reporting in addition to things like human rights activism and, poverty programming and all that sort of stuff. National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, stuff on there like kidnapping, domestic violence, trafficking, so on and so forth. And RAIN. RAIN is a really, really great source for folks that are interested in sex crimes because it also funds a lot of different research. And they don't just look at charges and convictions. They also look at unreported and underreported crimes through different types of surveys. So for next week, because that is all I got for today, start thinking about topics. Remember, it can be pretty much anything. I'm going to post a list of topics people have done in the past, if that's helpful. But also the whole point is for you to like pick something that you're actually interested in, because if you're not interested, you're not going to want to do it and you're going to put very little effort into it. You're not going to care and it's going to be shitty for me to read. So think about something you're actually interested in related to criminal justice. I will post a list of potentials. If it's not on the list, then ask me for your paper. Yep. And then for projects, same thing. What we'll do next week is you'll make a list of like your top 3, and then you'll be paired with people based on that. Yep, for the actual projects.